The wind that sweeps across the Wyoming plains in late summer does not feel like wind. It feels like a physical weight, a living thing that pushes against the earth with ancient, relentless force. In 1945, that wind carried with it something that had no business existing in the American West. The sound of a transport truck engine groaning under the weight of the Japanese Empire's most loyal daughters. They were not soldiers, but they were warriors in spirit, raised on the code of Bushido, taught that death was the only honorable exit from war. They arrived at a cattle ranch expecting the cold steel of a firing squad or the damp rot of a dungeon. Instead, they were met by men in cowboy hats who tipped their brims and told them to wash up for a hot dinner. This is not a story of battlefields, treaties, or generals. This is the forgotten, almost unbelievable true story of what happened when the code of the West collided with the code of the samurai in the middle of nowhere, and how a group of prisoners found freedom inside a cage. The dust rose in slow, choking spirals over the high plains, turning the afternoon sun into a hazy, blood-orange disk that seemed to stare down without mercy. The convoy of military trucks moved like a dark scar across the golden landscape, their engines grinding against the silence of the prairie. Inside the canvas-covered beds of those trucks, the air was hot, stale, and thick with the smell of gasoline, sweat, and terror. These were not hardened infantrymen or captured spies, they were women. Nurses, clerical auxiliaries, and support staff captured in the Pacific Theater, dragged from the ruins of their posts and shipped across an ocean they never thought they would cross. They sat shoulder to shoulder on hard wooden benches, their bodies swaying with every pothole, every turn of the wheel. They were silent not because they had nothing to say, but because fear had stolen their voices. In their minds, they were already ghosts. Their training had been explicit, drilled into them since childhood and reinforced by every officer they had ever served under. To be captured was a stain worse than death. It was a spiritual erasure. To survive in the hands of the enemy was not a stroke of luck. It was a humiliation that would follow them into the afterlife. They clutched their small, tattered belongings, a satchel here, a photograph there, as if these physical objects were the last anchors to a reality that was rapidly dissolving. The journey to this strange, alien place had been a psychological torture that no interrogation room could match. It had started weeks ago in the suffocating humidity of the Philippines, followed by the terrifying, claustrophobic darkness of a transport ship's hold, where the sound of the ocean hammered against the hull like a constant threat. Then came San Francisco, emerging from the fog like a fortress of steel and stone, and finally the train ride. That endless, rattling train ride across the American interior was perhaps the cruelest part of all. Through the narrow slats of the boxcars and the smeared glass of the passenger windows, they had looked out at the enemy's homeland, expecting to see a nation on its knees. They had been told by their propaganda that America was weak, a mongrel nation collapsing under the weight of its own greed, its cities burning, its people starving. But the view from the train shattered that lie with brutal efficiency. They saw factories humming with terrifying energy, smoke pouring from stacks that seemed to touch the sky. They saw towns, hundreds of them, untouched by bombs, with white picket fences and paved roads and children riding bicycles. They saw fields of corn and wheat that stretched for miles, an abundance of food that mocked the hunger gnawing at their own bellies. In Japan, entire cities were being flattened by fire, the wooden houses turning to ash in seconds. Here, massive white barns stood upright, painted and proud, their tin roofs gleaming like silver under the sun. It was a landscape of overwhelming power, a geography that whispered a terrifying truth. The enemy was not just strong, the enemy was unbreakable. Aiko, a young nurse whose uniform hung loosely on her frame, sat near the tailgate of the lead truck, watching the dust swirl in the vacuum behind them. She felt a profound sense of vertigo, a dizziness that had nothing to do with the motion of the vehicle. The sheer scale of this land was paralyzing. The sky was too big, the horizon was too far away. It made her feel small, insignificant, like an insect crawling across a table. She tried to summon the hatred she had been taught to feel. She tried to picture the Americans as the monsters from the posters, the devils with fangs and horns who would ravage and destroy, but the landscape refused to cooperate with her fear. The air smelled sweet, carrying the scent of cut grass, sagebrush, and pine resin instead of cordite and rotting jungle vegetation. It was a smell of peace, and it terrified her more than the smell of war ever had because it made no sense. Why would the monsters live in a place so beautiful? Why would the land of the savages smell like rain and earth? Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that matched the grinding of the gears as the truck began to slow. The convoy turned off the main gravel road and crunched onto a dirt path that wound toward a cluster of buildings nestled at the base of a low range of hills. The brakes squealed, a high-pitched shriek that made the women flinch as one. The tailgate dropped with a loud, metallic clang that echoed like a gunshot in the quiet afternoon. The order came, barked by a guard in a dusty uniform. Out, line up. The women moved stiffly, their legs numb from hours of sitting, their boots scuffling on the metal bed of the truck. They stepped out into sunlight so bright it felt like a physical blow, stabbing at eyes accustomed to the gloom of the canvas cover. They huddled together instinctively, a tight knot of gray and green uniforms against the vast browns and golds of the ranch. They blinked, shielding their eyes, their breath caught in their throats. They waited for the guard towers. They waited for the barbed wire to be electrified. They waited for the snarling Dobermans straining at their leashes. They waited for the cold, gray walls of a penitentiary, but there were no towers, there were no dogs, there was no concrete. Instead, they found themselves standing in the middle of a working cattle ranch. The ground beneath their boots was hard-packed earth, etched with the hoofprints of horses and the tracks of tires. The air was thick with the smell of hay, fresh manure, and the faint, savory aroma of wood smoke drifting from a distant chimney. To their left stood a massive wooden barn, its red paint faded by the sun to a soft rust color. To their right, a windmill turned lazily against the horizon, its metal blades creaking with a rhythmic, hypnotic sound, creak thump, that sounded nothing like the machinery of war. Beyond the wooden fences stretched rolling hills the color of old brass, dotted with cattle that grazed with an indifference that felt almost insulting. The cows chewed their cud, watching the newcomers with large, glassy eyes, unaware that a world war was raging, unaware that these women were enemies of the state. It was a scene of pastoral tranquility that clashed violently with the terror in the women's hearts. Aiko looked around, her eyes wide, trying to process the visual information. Was this a trick? A psychological game designed to lower their defenses before the real horror began. She gripped the strap of her canvas satchel so tightly her knuckles turned white, and then she saw them. Walking toward the group of trembling women were three men. They were not wearing military uniforms. They were not carrying Thompson submachine guns. They were dressed in denim trousers that were worn white at the knees, shirts stained with sweat and dirt, and wide-brimmed hats that cast deep shadows over their eyes. Boots with silver spurs that jingled softly with every step, chink, 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 crushed the dry grass as they approached. They were cowboys, American cowboys. The archetypal figures the Japanese propaganda machine had painted as lawless, violent savages who slaughtered natives and drank whiskey like water. Aiko took a half step back, her breath hitching. These were the barbarians, these were the men who would execute them. One of them, a man named Walt, stopped a few feet away. He was tall, with shoulders that looked like they had been hewn from oak, and a face that was a map of lines etched by the sun and wind. He shifted his weight to one leg, took a pouch of tobacco from his shirt pocket, and calmly rolled a cigarette with one hand. He didn't scream, he didn't draw a weapon, he didn't even look angry. He looked bored. He lit the cigarette, inhaled deeply, and let the smoke drift out of his nose before looking over the group of terrified women with a gaze that was more appraising than hostile. He looked like a man sizing up a herd of new stock, checking for weakness, checking for strength. He spat a flake of tobacco into the dust and pointed a gloved hand toward the open doors of the barn. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a low rumble like distant thunder. "Feed's got to be hauled before sundown," he said. The words were English, spoken with a slow, drawling cadence that blurred the vowels, making it hard for the women to understand. But the gesture was unmistakable. He wasn't ordering them to a firing squad, he was ordering them to do chores. The women looked at one another, bewildered, exchanging frantic, whispered questions in Japanese. What did he say? Is this the labor camp? Are we to dig our own graves? But before they could spiral further into panic, the other cowboys moved forward, not with rifles, but with pitchforks and heavy burlap sacks. They thrust the tools toward the women, their expressions expectant. The logic was brutal and simple. You are here, you have hands, there is work to be done. Within minutes, the women were no longer prisoners of war, they were ranch hands. They were handed sacks of grain that weighed nearly as much as they did. They were pointed toward the loft. They were told to move, the work was grueling. The sacks were rough, scratching their skin through the thin fabric of their uniforms. The dust from the grain filled their noses and mouths, making them cough. Their slender arms, weakened by months of rationing and travel, strained and trembled under the weight. Eiko stumbled more than once, her boots slipping on the slick straw of the barn floor. Each time she fell, she flinched, waiting for the blow. She waited for the boot to the ribs, the whip, the rifle butt, the standard punishments for weakness in the camps they had heard about, but the blow never came. The cowboys simply watched, occasionally stepping in to right a toppled sack or point to a better path, their faces impassive. They worked alongside the women, hoisting the heaviest loads themselves with a casual strength that was terrifying in its own way. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, turning the light from blinding white to a soft, hazy gold. The heat didn't break, but the shadows grew longer, stretching across the dirt floor of the barn like reaching fingers. By the time the sun touched the horizon, the women were exhausted. Their hands were blistered, raw and weeping. Their uniforms were dark with sweat and caked with grime. They stood in the yard, chests heaving, waiting for the command to return to their cells. But then the bell rang, a sharp, clear clang that cut through the evening air, signaling the end of the workday. The smell of food drifted from the mess hall, a long, low building with smoke curling from its chimney. It was a rich, meaty smell, savory and deep, the smell of beef and onions and gravy. It hit the women's empty stomachs with the force of a physical blow, making them cramp with sudden, violent hunger. They had not eaten a real meal in weeks. They stood frozen, unsure of the protocol. Did prisoners eat? Did they eat the scraps left over by the guards? Did they eat on the floor? The cowboys wiped their brows with their sleeves, dusted off their hats, and began to walk toward the mess hall. The women watched them go, assuming they were to wait outside until the men were finished. But at the door, Walt stopped. He turned around, his silhouette framed by the warm yellow light spilling from inside the building. He looked at the group of huddled, dirty, terrified women standing in the twilight. He didn't bark an order, he didn't sneer. He simply stepped back, holding the door open with one hand and tipping the brim of his hat with the other. He looked directly at Eiko, his eyes catching hers for a brief, electric moment, and said two words that shattered her understanding of the world completely. Ladies first. No one moved. The silence that followed was louder than the wind, louder than the trucks, louder than the war itself. The world had turned upside down. the enemy had opened the door. And in that hesitation, in the space between the cowboy's words and the women's first tentative step, the true story of the camp began. The wooden floorboards of the mess hall creaked under the hesitation of 20 pairs of boots. The women moved across the threshold like sleepwalkers entering a dream they didn't trust, their eyes darting to the corners of the room, scanning for the trap. But there was no trap, only long wooden tables scrubbed clean and set with tin plates that gleamed dully in the lantern light. The air inside was warm and thick with the aroma of the stew, a scent so heavy with beef, onions, and black pepper that it made the saliva pool instantly in their mouths, painful and sharp. Aiko felt her stomach spasm, a violent reminder of the hollowness that had defined her existence for months. She stood by the bench, afraid to sit, afraid to claim a space she had been taught she didn't deserve. Behind them, the cowboys remained outside or leaned against the door frames, arms crossed, hats pulled low, waiting with a patience that was unnerving. In the Japanese military hierarchy, the strong ate first, the weak ate what was left. Here, the captors stood back and watched the captives eat. It was a reversal of order so complete it made Aiko dizzy. She looked at the nearest cowboy, Walt, expecting a sneer or a command to hurry up. He simply nodded at the pot. Slowly trembling, she sat down. When the first spoonful of stew touched her lips, the sensation was overwhelming. It wasn't just food, it was heat, it was salt, it was life. The meat was tender, falling apart on her tongue, the broth rich and thick. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, not from sadness, but from the sheer physical shock of nourishment. Around the table, the only sound was the scraping of spoons against tin and the occasional sniffle. They ate with a ferocity they tried to hide, shoveling the food in, terrified it would be taken away if they paused. The cowboys watched, but not with the predatory gaze of guards. They watched with a quiet, detached curiosity, like men observing a herd that had been through a hard winter. When the pots were empty and the women sat back, dazed and full, only then did the men move to the line to serve themselves. They took the leftovers, scraping the bottom of the pots without complaint, sitting on the floor or on the porch steps to eat. Aiko watched them through the window, her heart pounding. This act of chivalry, this simple ladies first, struck her harder than any physical blow. A beating she could have understood. It would have confirmed her worldview that the enemy was a beast. But this kindness, it was a weapon that slipped past her armor and cut deep into the certainty of her hatred. That night they slept in a wooden barracks that smelled of cedar and dust. There were no concrete floors, no dripping walls. Instead, there were rows of cots with straw mattresses and wool blankets that smelled of mothballs and detergent. Aiko lay in the dark, staring at the rafters. Outside, the wind howled across the plains, rattling the window panes, but inside it was warm. She ran her hand over the rough wool of the blanket. It was soft compared to the damp earth she had slept on in the transit camps. She felt a crushing weight of guilt settle onto her chest. To accept the enemy's food, to sleep in the enemy's bed, to be warmed by the enemy's blankets, was this not treason? She thought of her brothers fighting in the Pacific, perhaps starving in a jungle while she lay here with a full belly. The comfort felt like a betrayal. She tried to summon the face of the emperor, to recite the codes of honor she had memorized in school, but the images were blurry, obscured by the memory of the cowboy holding the door open. Sleep came eventually, not as a relief, but as an escape from the confusion that was tearing her mind apart. The next morning began before the sun. A bell clanged across the yard, a harsh, metallic sound that shattered the pre-dawn silence. The women jerked awake, adrenaline flooding their systems, scrambling into their uniforms with fumbling fingers. They expected a roll call, a shouting match, an inspection where the slightest flaw would be punished. They lined up outside in the shivering cold, their breath pluming in the gray light. The mountains to the west were jagged silhouettes against a sky that was slowly turning a bruised purple. Walt and the other ranch hands were already there, drinking coffee from tin cups, their breath misting in the air. There was no shouting, there was no formation. Walt simply tossed the dregs of his coffee into the dirt, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and walked toward the barn. "Sun's coming," he said, his voice gravelly with sleep. "Cattle don't wait." It was an invitation, not a command. The women followed, falling into step behind the men, their boots crunching on the frozen grass. The work that day was brutal, a physical assault that tested every limit of their endurance. They were tasked with hauling feed, mending fences, and clearing out the stalls. The sun rose higher, burning off the morning chill and turning the ranch into a furnace. The air shimmered with heat waves that distorted the horizon. Aiko found herself tasked with moving 50-pound sacks of grain from a delivery truck to the loft. She was small, her frame wasted by the war, and the sacks were dead weight, awkward and rough. She watched the Cowboys do it, swinging the sacks onto their shoulders in one fluid motion, using their legs, their momentum. She tried to mimic them, but her muscles screamed in protest. She bent, grabbed the corners of the burlap, and heaved. The sack barely moved. She tried again, gritting her teeth, sweat stinging her eyes. She managed to lift it to her waist, staggering under the load, her knees trembling violently. It happened in the early afternoon, when the sun was a white eye staring down without mercy. Aiko was hoisting a sack, her vision blurring with exhaustion. She took a step, her boot caught on a root, and she went down. The sack slammed into the dirt, bursting open and spilling golden grain across the ground. She fell hard, the impact knocking the wind out of her. She lay there in the dirt, gasping, waiting for the shadow. In the camps she had come from, spilling food was a crime. Weakness was a crime. She curled into a ball instinctively, covering her head with her arms, bracing for the kick, the whip, the scream. She heard boots approaching, heavy, rhythmic steps that stopped right beside her head. She squeezed her eyes shut, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. This is it, she thought. This is when the mask falls off. This is when the monster appears, but there was no kick. Instead, she heard the sound of liquid sloshing. A shadow fell over her, cooling the burning skin of her neck. She slowly lowered her arms and looked up. Walt was standing over her, blotting out the sun. He wasn't holding a whip, he was holding a canteen. It was an old, battered thing, covered in felt that was soaked in water to keep the contents cool. Condensation dripped from its metal sides, falling onto the dry dust near her face. He didn't speak, he just unscrewed the cap and held it out to her. Aiko stared at it, her mind unable to process the gesture. Water, water offered by the hand of the enemy. Her training screamed that it was poison, that it was a trick, that she should spit in his face and die with honor. But her throat was like sandpaper. Her body betrayed her ideology. Slowly, with a shaking hand, she reached up and took the canteen. She lifted it to her lips and drank. The water was metallic and cool, tasting of tin and the deep earth of a well. It washed away the dust, the fear, the dryness. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. She drank until she choked, coughing as the water ran down her chin and soaked into her collar. She lowered the canteen, wiping her mouth, and looked up at Walt. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't mocking her. He was just watching, his face unreadable behind the shadow of his hat brim. He reached down, not to strike her, but to offer a hand. She stared at the gloved hand, the leather worn smooth by work. To take it was to admit she needed help. To take it was to touch the enemy. She hesitated for a heartbeat, then reached up. His grip was firm, calloused, and immensely strong. He pulled her to her feet as if she weighed nothing. "Easy," he murmured. "Heat'll get you if you fight it." He bent down, scooped up the spilled grain with his hands, and tossed the empty sack aside. "Pace yourself," he said, then turned and walked back to his own work. Aiko stood there, swaying slightly, the taste of the water still on her tongue. The interaction had lasted less than a minute, but it had shifted the axis of her world. He hadn't punished her for her failure, he had helped her. And in that help, he had stripped away the caricature of the barbarian she had been fighting in her mind. A barbarian does not share his water. A monster does not pull you out of the dirt. She looked around the yard. The other women were watching, their work paused, their eyes wide. They had seen it too. A silent ripple passed through the group, a collective exhalation of breath. The tension that had held them rigid since their arrival began to slacken just a fraction. They weren't safe, they knew they were still prisoners, but the immediate threat of violence had receded. From that moment on, the dynamic of the camp began to change. The Cowboys didn't speak much, they were men of silence and action, but they began to teach. They didn't conduct classes or give lectures, they taught through the language of labor, which was universal. When a woman struggled to tie a knot to secure a gate, a ranch hand named Slim didn't shove her aside. He came over, untied the messy tangle she had made, and slowly, with exaggerated movements, tied a perfect bowline. He did it again and again until she mimicked the motion. "Loop goes under the rabbit hole," he muttered, a phrase that meant nothing to her, but his fingers showed the way. When another woman held a shovel wrong, straining her back, a cowboy gently corrected her grip, tapping her elbow to lower it, showing her how to use the leverage of the handle. "Let the tool do the work," he said. They nodded, they watched, they learned. There was even, amidst the sweat and the exhaustion, a flicker of humor. It was fragile, dangerous, but it was there. One afternoon, a young woman named Yumi dropped a hammer on her toe. In a flash of pain, she shouted a sharp, guttural curse in Japanese. The cowboy working next to her, a redhead with a face full of freckles, looked up startled. He didn't get angry. He laughed, a short, barking sound of amusement. He tried to repeat the word, mangling the vowels, turning the sharp Japanese curse into a clumsy, drawling American sound. Yumi, despite the pain, giggled. It was a shocking sound in the prison camp, a giggle. The cowboy grinned, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "That a bad word?" he asked, pantomiming washing his mouth out with soap. Yumi nodded, covering her mouth to hide her smile. "Bad," she said in broken English. "Very bad." The cowboy chuckled and went back to hammering. That small exchange, that shared moment of human reaction to pain and absurdity, did more to dismantle the war between them than any treaty could have. As the weeks went by, the women began to change physically. The softness of their previous lives, the malnutrition of the transit camps, began to give way to a lean, hard strength. Their hands grew calloused, the skin toughening to handle the rough burlap in the wooden fence posts. Their faces browned in the sun, shedding the pale, ghostly look of the prison ships. They learned the rhythm of the ranch, the early rise, the heavy breakfast, the steady, pacing work of the morning, the heat of the midday lull, and the long push to sundown. They learned to read the sky for weather, to read the ears of the horses for mood. They stopped moving like prisoners, with hunched shoulders and downcast eyes. They began to move like workers, with purpose and economy. The Cowboys noticed. They stopped treating them like fragile china dolls or dangerous enemies, and started treating them like hands. The ladies first at dinner remained, a stubborn piece of Western etiquette that Walt refused to abandon, but in the yard there was equality in the sweat. If a cow broke loose, the women were expected to help turn it back. If a fence went down, they were expected to hold the wire. The respect was grudging at first, born of necessity, but it grew into something real. It was the code of the West. You judge a person by how they stand in the dirt, not by the flag they salute. One evening, as the sun began to bleed into the western horizon, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and violet, Eiko stood by the water trough, washing the grime from her arms. The water was cold, shocking her tired muscles. She scrubbed at a stain of grease on her elbow, watching the dirt swirl away in the clear water. She looked up and saw Walt leaning against the corral fence, smoking his evening cigarette. He was watching the sunset, his face relaxed, the hard lines around his eyes softened by the twilight. He sensed her looking and turned his head. He didn't smile, but he nodded, a short, sharp dip of the chin. "Good work today," he said. The words drifted across the yard, quiet and simple. Aiko didn't understand good work, but she understood the nod. It was an acknowledgement, a validation. She dried her hands on her apron and looked at the other women gathering near the mess hall. They looked tired, their uniforms stained, their hair windblown, but they didn't look defeated. They looked alive. Aiko felt a strange, terrifying sensation rising in her chest. It wasn't hope. Hope was too dangerous a thing to hold on to yet. It was something more complex. It was the realization that the line between enemy and friend was not a wall of stone, but a line drawn in the dust, easily scuffed out by a boot. And as she walked toward the smell of dinner, she realized with a jolt of clarity that these men, these barbarians, had shown her more honor in a week of captivity than her own government had shown her in a lifetime of obedience. The cruelty she had prepared for would have been easy to resist. It would have made her a martyr. But this kindness, this water, this food, this respect, it was disarming her completely, leaving her vulnerable in a way that terrified her to her very soul. She was surviving the war, but she wasn't sure if her hatred would survive the peace. The rhythm of the ranch soon settled into a routine that was as predictable as the sunrise. Yet it never ceased to be disorienting for the women. Every evening the bell would clang, signaling the end of labor, and the strange ritual of the mess hall would repeat itself. It was a piece of theater that defied all the laws of war Aiko knew. The cowboys, dusty and tired, would line up by the door, removing their hats to reveal pale foreheads in contrast to their sun-weathered faces. They would stand there, smelling of horses and tobacco, and wait. They would not move toward the food until every single Japanese prisoner had entered, taken a plate, and sat down. This was the ladies' first rule, enforced by Walt with a quiet, ironclad stare that brooked no argument. Inside, the air was always thick with the smell of American abundance, roast beef swimming in dark gravy, mounds of mashed potatoes that steamed like small volcanoes. Fresh bread with crusts so thick they had to be torn apart. For women who had spent months surviving on rice balls and watery soup, this was not just a meal. It was a daily shock to the system. They ate in silence, heads bowed, the clinking of silverware the only sound in the room. The food sat heavy in their stomachs, a delicious weight that brought with it a confusing cocktail of gratitude and guilt. To eat the enemy's food was necessary for survival, but to enjoy it, to feel the warmth of the beef stew spread through their limbs, that felt like a small treason. Aiko would often glance up from her plate to the window, watching the cowboys sitting on the porch steps outside, plates balanced on their knees, eating the leftovers. They laughed softly among themselves, their voices low and rumbling. They never complained about waiting. They never looked at the women with resentment for taking the best cuts. This silent, daily act of chivalry was eroding the women's defenses more effectively than any interrogation could have. It stripped them of their status as enemies and forced them to be simply women. It was a psychological disarming that left them defenseless against the creeping realization that these men were decent. Then came the evening that changed everything. The dinner plates had been cleared, and the women were preparing to return to the barracks when Walt walked in carrying a wooden crate. He set it down on the head table with a heavy thud. It was filled with lined paper, envelopes, and yellow pencils. "Write home," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet hall. "Red Cross is making a run." Letters got to be unsealed for the censors, but write what you want. He stepped back and crossed his arms. The room went deathly still. The women stared at the crate as if it contained a bomb. Writing home, it was the thing they had dreamed of in the dark hold of the ship, the prayer they had whispered at night. but now that the paper was in front of them, it felt like a trap. Aiko walked forward slowly and took a sheet of paper and a pencil. She sat back down, the wood of the bench hard against her spine. She stared at the blue lines of the paper, the graphite tip of the pencil hovering over the white space. The other women were doing the same, frozen in a collective paralysis. What could they possibly say? The truth was a dangerous thing. If Aiko wrote to her mother in Nagasaki and said, "I am alive. The Americans feed me beef and treat me with respect," she would be branding herself a traitor. The narrative back home was absolute. The Americans were monsters, and Japanese soldiers died before surrendering. To admit she was being treated well would be to admit that the propaganda was a lie, and that her survival was not a shameful ordeal, but a confusing mercy. Her family would not understand. They might even be ashamed of her comfort while they starved under the blockade, but she could not lie either. She could not bring herself to write, "I am suffering." They beat us, that would be a betrayal of the truth she was living, a betrayal of Walt, who had pulled her from the dust, and the cook who gave them extra bread. The pencil shook in her hand. Around the room, the sound of weeping began, soft, stifled sobs that came from the unbearable pressure of the dilemma. They were trapped in the moral no man's land between loyalty to their country and gratitude to their captors. Some women began to write furiously, tears blotting the ink. They wrote informal, stilted phrases, hiding behind the rigidity of the language. "I am safe, the weather is cold." "Do not worry," they stripped their letters of all emotion, all detail, turning their lives into gray, bureaucratic reports. Aiko watched a woman near her, Yumi, write 2 lines and then violently scribble them out, tearing the paper in frustration. Yumi looked up, her eyes red. "How do I tell them?" she whispered fiercely. "How do I tell them the enemy is kind?" Aiko had no answer. She looked down at her own paper. She thought of the wind on the plains, the way the horses breathed in the morning cold, the taste of the water from Walt's canteen. She pressed the pencil to the paper, but she couldn't form the characters for kindness or gratitude. Instead, she wrote a riddle. "The wind here is honest," she wrote. "The grass is tall." It was a code, a way to say I am free inside this cage, hoping her mother would read between the lines. But even as she wrote it, she felt the weight of the secret she was keeping. When Walt came around to collect the letters, his usual easy gait was slower, more hesitant. He saw the tear-streaked faces, the piles of crumpled paper on the floor. He didn't ask questions. He didn't read the open letters as he picked them up. He simply stacked them with a gentle hand, treating the fragile, tear-stained pages with the same respect he treated the women themselves. When he reached Aiko, she held her letter out, her hand trembling. He took it, and for a second his eyes met hers. There was a flicker of sadness in them, a recognition of the pain this gift had caused. He tipped his hat, a silent apology. That night, Aiko lay awake for hours. She thought about the letter sitting in the crate, traveling across the ocean, carrying a version of the truth that was barely half told. She realized then that the true captivity wasn't the fence or the ranch. It was the silence she had to keep. The kindness of the Americans was a secret burden, one she had to carry alone because the world outside wasn't ready to hear it. Walt had once said in his slow cowboy drawl that a man's kindness can be sharper than a knife. At the time, she hadn't understood. Now, with the memory of the unwritten truths burning in her mind, she finally did. Cruelty would have hardened her heart, making it easy to be an enemy. Compassion had broken her heart open, leaving her defenseless. And as she drifted into a restless sleep, she knew that she would never be able to tell her family the real story of the Wyoming plains. The enemy waits until we are fed, she thought. And that is the hardest thing of all to forgive. To the Japanese women, these animals were terrifying, creatures of raw power and unpredictable danger that towered over them. But the work of the ranch required them, and Walt insisted. One afternoon, he led a chestnut mare into the corral and motioned for Aiko. "She's gentle," he murmured, his voice low and soothing, not just for the horse, but for the woman trembling beside it. He showed her how to mount, explaining the mechanics of the stirrup and the saddle horn with patient gestures. Aiko tried, her foot slipping, her body awkward and stiff with fear. She tumbled backward into the dirt, landing hard. For a second, silence held the air, and then the men chuckled. But Aiko, looking up at the freckled cowboy who had laughed with Yumi, realized it wasn't the laughter of mockery. It was the laughter of shared effort, the kind that happens when a rookie makes a mistake. A smile cracked her dusty face. She stood up, brushed herself off, and tried again. On the fourth try, she swung her leg over and found her seat. Sitting tall in the saddle, feeling the living rhythm of the animal beneath her, Aiko felt a surge of adrenaline that wasn't fear. It was power. For the first time since her capture, she felt taller than her circumstances. She was no longer a prisoner, she was a rider. But the plains had one more lesson to teach them, and it wouldn't be gentle. It began on a Tuesday afternoon when the sky turned a bruised, sickly purple. The air grew heavy and still, pressing down on the ranch like a physical weight. "Storm's coming," Walt said, looking west. The words were barely out of his mouth when the wind hit, a screaming gale that tore the hats from their heads and blinded them with grit. Then the sky split open. Rain came down in solid sheets, turning the dry earth into slick, treacherous mud in seconds. Thunder shook the ground, and in the flash of lightning they saw disaster. A section of the barbed wire fence, weakened by the wind, snapped with a sound like a gunshot. The cattle, terrified by the noise and the storm, surged toward the gap. In that moment, the social order of the camp dissolved. There was no time for orders, no time for translation. Walt shouted, grabbing a rope, but he couldn't stop the herd alone. Aiko didn't think, she reacted. She didn't run for the safety of the barracks, she ran toward the breach. Around her, the other women did the same, slipping and sliding in the mud, their uniforms soaked instantly, forming a human wall to turn the cattle back. Walt looked up, rain streaming off the brim of his hat, and saw Aiko grabbing the halter of the panicked calf, wrestling it back from the wire. He froze for a split second. He didn't see an enemy. He didn't see a prisoner, he saw a partner. They worked side by side for an hour that felt like a lifetime, men and women, captors and captives, united by the desperate need to save the herd. When the storm finally broke, leaving the prairie shimmering under a silver light, they stood together in the ankle-deep mud, chests heaving, exhausted. The herd was safe, the fence was patched. Walt wiped the rain from his eyes and looked at Aiko. There was no bowing, no salute. They simply stared at each other, two humans breathing the same wet air, stripped of their labels by the violence of the storm. In the chaos, the wire between them had snapped just like the fence, and they both knew it would never truly be repaired. The next morning dawned strange and still. The air held a quiet that felt unnatural, as though the world itself were holding its breath. The women rose as they always did, washing in the chill of dawn, tying their hair back, preparing for the day's labor. But the cowboys were different. They moved with a heaviness that hadn't been there before. They spoke in hushed tones, voices low and uncertain, their eyes avoiding the horizon. A radio crackled from the porch of the main house, its static whisper cutting through the usual morning sounds of boots and animals. Aiko noticed Walt standing beside it, his hat in his hands, eyes fixed on the small machine as if it were speaking the voice of God. She couldn't understand the rapid-fire English words pouring from the speaker, but she saw the shift ripple through the men, the bowed heads, the solemn stillness. The way Slim took off his hat and ran a hand through his hair. One of them turned away, kicking at the dirt, murmuring something that sounded like a prayer or a curse. By mid-morning, the rumor had spread across the ranch like smoke. Walt walked over to where the women were gathering near the barn. He didn't have his usual easy stride. He walked like a man carrying a heavy load. He stopped in front of them, looking at their faces, faces he had come to know, faces he had seen covered in dust and sweat and rain. He didn't speak right away. His usual calm seemed heavier now, his eyes distant. Finally, he said only 2 words, his voice gentle but final. "It's done." The women stared back, blank and unmoving. The syllables meant little to them linguistically, but the tone carried the weight of the world. Aiko felt at first not relief, but something closer to vertigo. The ground seemed to tilt beneath her, surrender. The concept was a black hole in her mind. To the Americans, it was victory, it was the end of the killing. But to the women, it was the collapse of their entire moral universe. Surrender was the ultimate shame. They had been raised in a society where the emperor was divine, where the military code demanded death before dishonor. For the emperor to bow, for the nation to yield, meant that everything they had believed in, every sacrifice, every hardship, had been broken. Some of the women began to cry, not softly, but with guttural, choking sounds that came from a place beyond reason. Others sat down in the dirt, silent and pale, their hands trembling. Aiko couldn't cry. She felt hollow, emptied out. All her life she had been told that to live under the mercy of an enemy was a stain that could never be washed away. Yet she had lived. She had worked, eaten, even laughed, and now she didn't know what that made her. A survivor, a traitor, a ghost. She looked at the Cowboys, waiting for the change. This was the moment she had feared since the beginning. Now that they were the victors, surely the mask would fall. Now they would celebrate. Now they would mock the defeated. But the Cowboys did not cheer. There were no shouts of victory, no gloating gestures. Walt simply lowered his eyes, his face unreadable. One of the younger ranch hands brought out the American flag that usually hung in the mess hall. Aiko braced herself, expecting him to wave it, to shout, to rub their noses in their defeat. Instead, the man folded it. He folded it carefully, methodically, tucking the corners in with respectful hands, and set it aside on the porch railing. The silence between the 2 groups deepened, not awkward but sacred. Walt knew that for these women, this news was a funeral. In that silence, his respect spoke louder than any speech could have. He offered them the dignity of their grief. The days of the ranch were numbered after that. The routine began to dismantle itself. The whistle of the departing train eventually pierced the crisp morning air, signaling the end of their time in the Wyoming wilderness. The women stood on the platform, clutching their small belongings. They looked different now than the terrified creatures who had arrived months ago. They were stronger, their skin tanned by the high plains sun, their hands calloused from work that had tested every limit of their endurance. Aiko stood apart, inhaling the faint scent of tobacco and hay one last time. She looked toward the fence line where the horses were grazing. She thought of the mare she had learned to ride, the way the animal had trusted her. She thought of the storm, the mud, the shared water. Walt came to see them off. He didn't say much. He wasn't a man of many words, but he moved down the line, nodding to each woman. When he reached Aiko, he stopped. He tipped his hat, a gesture that had once terrified her but now felt like a benediction. "You take care," he said. Aiko looked at him, etching his face into her memory, the lines around his eyes, the dust in the creases of his shirt. She didn't have the English words to explain what he had done for her. She couldn't tell him that he had destroyed her hatred. She couldn't tell him that his kindness had been a more effective weapon than any bomb because it had stripped her of her enemy. She simply bowed, a low, respectful bow of her own culture. Walt hesitated, then awkwardly, stiffly, he bowed back. It was a clumsy gesture, unrehearsed and foreign to him, but it was perfect. The train lurched forward, steam hissing from the engine. The landscape began to slide past, the golden fields, the rolling hills, the white barns. Aiko pressed her face to the glass, watching the ranch disappear behind a curtain of dust and sunlight. As the miles slipped away, she realized with a mixture of disbelief and awe that she was leaving the only place in the war where she had felt like a human being. She was returning to a Japan of ashes and occupation, a homeland that had been destroyed, but she was taking something back with her that couldn't be bombed or burned. She realized then the true definition of freedom. It was not the mere lifting of chains or the crossing of borders. Freedom had arrived in the quiet gestures, the patient guidance, and the respect that had been offered without expectation. It was in the ladies first at the door. It was in the canteen offered in the dust. That revelation, she understood, would stay with her far longer than any official declaration or formal homecoming. The real liberation had not been in leaving captivity behind, but in rediscovering what it meant to be treated with dignity. By the time the train rolled into the station of the port city, the women were silent, not from exhaustion, but from contemplation. They carried within them a quiet pride, the kind that comes from surviving, adapting, and being seen. They had been hardened by loss, but softened by kindness. Eiko clutched her handkerchief, feeling the texture beneath her fingers. She knew that the world she was returning to would be hard. She knew there would be hunger and shame and rebuilding. But she also knew that she would never be the same. The war had ended, yet the lesson of humanity, once so fragile and unexpected, would follow her for the rest of her lives. It was a light she could carry through any darkness, a proof that even in the midst of devastation, even between enemies who were sworn to kill each other, dignity could endure. Years later, Eiko would look at a map of America, her finger tracing the line to Wyoming. She would remember the wind. She would remember the smell of the rain on the dry earth. And she would remember the enemy who had become, in the strangest of ways, a friend. She had learned that sometimes the greatest victory isn't defeating an opponent. It's the moment you realize there is no opponent left, only another person trying to survive the storm. The scar of that kindness would never fade, a reminder that in the vast, indifferent theater of war, the script could still be rewritten by a single act of decency.